So good morning. It's great to see you. Today, actually, this may or may not know this or even care, but it's 11 years to the day today, this weekend, I suppose, not to the day, but to this weekend that Narrate launched. I was this community of people that went, hey, what if we could be this kind of community together, and what would that look like? And going back 11 years, it was just and so thank you. Those of you that have been part of this from the beginning, or this is your first Sunday, or somewhere in between, every year it's just this reminder of there's 200-year-old churches out there. I don't know how they pulled it off, because every year feels like this gigantic accomplishment, and it's fun to be a community with you. So almost going back 11 years, it was just a few weeks removed from that very first Sunday where I was back in some meetings with like people that I'd learned under and spent 10 years kind of growing up under, I suppose, denominational meetings. It was in Bozeman at Journey Church, which is one of our mother churches, and of course, there were lots of attaboys because it's a big deal when you invest as much resource into a church plant as those people did. And so there was some attention brought to us on the stage, and then in between sessions / when you're skipping sessions, I was wandering around in the hallway. I can't remember which one it was. And Journey has this awesome lobby if you've ever been to their facility. So I was wandering around in the lobby, and this man came up to me, and as I recall, he was probably middle-aged, which turns out, I guess that's me now. And I remember him being very kind. I think he was cowboy-ish, and the reason why is because I remember, like, he was one of those guys that when I shook his hand, my first thought was, I've never worked a day in my life, because his hand engulfed mine and crushed it to millions of pieces. And he identified himself as someone that grew up in Helena, born and raised there, and only recently had moved away from Helena. And so with great enthusiasm, he's like, I'm so excited to hear that we're planning a church there. And then he said, so how's it going? Now, over probably the year prior to that, I'd been asked that question many, many times and realized that oftentimes I gave very cheap, kind of superficial answers. My tendency was to go, oh, it's going great, we're having a blast. And sometimes that was family members or people who were invested in this or just people who really wanted to know more, and I caught this sense of like, well, that didn't give them any information. And in other cases, I talked way too much and gave way too much information, so at some point, I think this was a Jim Collins thing, and maybe this makes me a sellout, whatever, but I literally developed these elevator speeches. Like, I was trying to figure out how can I put as much information in a 60-second reply as I possibly can. This was my first version, though I changed it. I said to him, the thing that really excites me about being a church in Helena is, I said, best I can tell, and we had done lots of research and hired demographic firms and things like that. I said, best I can tell, there's a lot of good churches in Helena, but from what I can tell, most of them, if not all of them, in most of them, if not all of them, Jesus is either a Republican or he's a Democrat, but it doesn't feel to me like there's many where he's either, or maybe even neither. And I said, so what's exciting to me is, listen, we're not going to be the only good church in town, but I feel like we get to step into this niche and serve people in a way that maybe people aren't being served in Helena right now. And I remember, like, this was one of those, like, wasn't that good? Like, come on. And as I was patting myself on the back, I remember his affect just completely changed. And the conversation ended rather quickly. And he walked off. And I don't remember how long it was, because I can be dense. I can't remember if it was in the moment or an hour later or a day later, but there was this sense of like, oh, I see what happened there. Like, in some sense, I did describe the church culture there, which means in another sense, I just indicted him, or at least spoke to the very thing that he doesn't buy into. What I didn't know in that moment, I had no idea in that moment, was like a wedding day, like a baptism, like that's not a decision you make once and you're good forever. What I didn't know was that 11 years later, we would be standing right back on that exact same point where we both individually and collectively get to make a decision. What kind of church do we want to be? What kind of community do you want to be? How do we want to represent Christ? Do we want to represent that there's room for people on both sides of the aisle to follow Jesus and follow him better and challenge their parties to follow him better? Or do we want to align? And it probably isn't lost on you that it feels to me, and I don't know if this is a function of age or stage or what it is, but it feels to me exponentially more difficult to pull off now than it was 11 years ago. The reality is this is our third general election as a community together. This is the third time where together we've navigated a general election. It feels like it's more contentious than ever. It feels maybe like it's more important than ever. I'm not sure to what degree that's true or not. But what is true is this is the third time that we've tried to form a conversation around this idea that goes something like, remember, we want this to be the kind of place that's safe for people on both sides of the aisle, where people from both sides and the middle can follow Jesus, can consider following Jesus, can grow in their relationship with Jesus, can speak truth to power to those that they are doing this with. And I think we're right back there. Now, here's my commitment to you. I've not changed. That doesn't mean I haven't done work, but I can with great integrity say I'm where I was 11 years ago. And that's a twofold thing for me. First of all, I feel like in my unique role on this staff team, it's my job to not use this platform to promote anybody. I can also say from a personal standpoint, I'm more invested. I understand the nuance a little bit better than I did 11 years ago. But quite frankly, I'm as split down the middle as I ever was. But I also want to respect that you're on your own journey. And the last thing I want to do is strong-arm anybody. I don't want to create ultimatums, but I also don't want to ask anyone to live through a charade. Like, if things are changed for you, and for you it's important to be in a place where you're aligned now with, where you know you're worshiping with people who share your values on one side or the other, then let me be the first to say that would make me very sad, but your own integrity is at stake. You may need to go find that place. My journey looks like this. I started studying for this series way back in the spring, and part of that was because I was self-aware enough to know, and again, I don't know if this is a function of age or culture or what, but that I'm thinking about this stuff more than I ever have. I'm pretty ambivalent politically, or at least I was. And I realized as early as this last spring that I've arrived at my ambivalence fairly honestly, I think. And I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not really saying it with any judgment in either direction, but I genuinely do not have a growing up memory of talking politics. Extended family, immediate family, like I talked to some of you, and some of you was like, well, we never talk politics, and some of you are like, that's all we ever talk politics. I have zero memory, negative or positive, or of talking politics growing up. My sister and I had to take turns spending the night at my grandpa and grandma's house, Grandpa Bill, Grandma Darlene. Every Saturday night, we would always fight, so it was like every other weekend we got to go to their house unless one person screwed up, and then it was the other person's advantage because they got to go 2 weeks in a row. So I spent countless hours with my Grandpa Bill and my Grandma Darlene. My grandma's still alive, and I have no idea how she votes. My Grandpa Bill, who passed several years ago, actually during a Christmas Eve gathering around here, I know lots of things about him. Much of who I am, I owe to him. I have no idea how he voted. I don't know how my mom votes. I don't even know if my dad does vote. So on some level, I feel like this has set me up for this. But what I started doing this last spring was trying to study this out and going, okay, because here was my question. I think I said it from the stage once, and I think I might have freaked some of you out, and that's okay. But my question became, and especially because I was surrounded by people whom I respect, who were digging into this stuff deeper than I had, and that challenged me, my question became, to what extent is my political ambivalence a function of my family of origin, which I'm grateful for, and to what extent is it a legitimate function of the gospel? Or I think the way I was saying it to myself, to what extent is my ambivalence a function of my family of origin, and to what extent is it a permission Jesus gives me, or maybe doesn't give me? And so I'm really, really grateful. You'll be surprised to know that I found this book by a guy named N.T. Wright. You've probably never heard of him. He wrote this great book. I know I've read it 3 times. There's sections of it I've read 4 and 5 times. As best I can tell, it's actually a collection of essays, and it's a book called God in Public. And I spent a lot of time in it this spring and started freaking myself out, actually, because here's my summary of the book. What if Jesus is more than your personal spiritual director, and what if the gospel is more than private? Now, that could get disruptive, and it was disruptive for me. I love a Jesus who wants to work on me inside out and just kind of let the chips fall where they were. I'm not so much into a Jesus whose primary objective is to get me into heaven, but I still think I lean towards a Jesus who wants to make me holy and make me healthy. But what if the gospel's public? And I think when you ask that question out loud and then you start looking at the text, it wasn't just that book. I started to realize, wait a minute, it is. The word evangelion, you may or may not know this, but the word that's translated good news or gospel, we've got it up there. But here's the meaning of that in Jesus' world. An imperial pronouncement that an heir to the empire's throne has been born, or that a distant battle had been won. So Jesus and the gospel writers, the Gospel of Matthew, Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, Gospel of John, they chose a word to speak to their world what Jesus had accomplished, and they chose a word that's the same word that would have been used to speak to when Caesar had a son, or when more land had been won. I think it begins to challenge many of us in our sense that the gospel is for private spirituality, and that God is like the old man that we shut him up in the attic and we only let him down on Christmas and Easter. That the gospel is fundamentally public. In fact, and I'm indebted to N.T. Wright for this one, resurrection itself, far from being about where we go from we die, it includes that, is a very public claim. We've talked a little bit in the past. There's three major philosophical, religious streams of thought in Jesus' day: Epicureanism, Stoicism, and the academy, or what we would call the university. Epicurus was a philosopher who in many ways rescued culture from some very heinous spiritual beliefs, and by more or less saying, hey, listen, God's not hovering over, so stop sacrificing your sons. At best, God's a long ways away. This philosophy was picked back up during the Enlightenment because it had a way of saying God's a long ways away, and so stop basing all your decisions on that. But the resurrection, to the extent that it happened, it challenges the notion that God's a long ways off. A God who becomes human, a God who's born in a time, in a region, to a place, to a people that are trapped and ensnared in major political tension. Stoicism, another major philosophical thought in Jesus' day, it has some really positive qualities to it. It would resemble in many ways pantheism today in that it says God is everything. I mean, there's a razor-thin line between God is everywhere and God is everything. Resurrection says, no, God is distinct from God's creation, which creates conversations of accountability and expectation. The academy, much like our intellectual university today, the academy said, we can't actually know anything about God. There's too much going on. It's a mystery, so we move that over here and don't base it on our decisions. But to the extent that the resurrection occurred, the claim of the New Testament writers was there's still a lot left unknown about God, but there's some things that become crystal clear in the person of Jesus. That's where John says things like, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And Hebrews says, like, the fullness of God was made clear in him. Suddenly, there's things about God and God's character that can become known. The observation would simply be this: what if the gospel's public? And what if we do have a moral, spiritual obligation to figure out the implications of that? In Luke 17, whoa, there went one of my notes, because I try not to turn around and read the screen. I think that was N.T. Wright. Guess that's a commentary. So Luke 17, there's this place where some people ask Jesus, like, hey, when's the kingdom coming? And listen to what Jesus says. It says, once Jesus was asked by the Pharisees when the kingdom of God was coming, and he answered, the kingdom of God's not coming with things that can be observed, nor will they say, look, here it is, or there it is. For the kingdom of God is among you. Now the question becomes, what does among you mean? Within your midst is often suggests. If we allow it to, speaks to an internal, mystical, exclusively mystical spiritual experience. Some would argue that the best way to translate that is the kingdom of God is within your grasp. In other words, Jesus is going, you know when the kingdom's going to come. It's going to come when you start making it happen. When you actually partner with God, and in your sector and in your vocation and in your world and in your community, you start aligning yourself with that God's priorities, the kingdom comes through you. N.T. Wright says it this way, which I think is down there now. The passage holds out an invitation to this day to those who are anxious about the future. God's sovereign rule over the world, his healing love are not only yours for the grasping, but are waiting for your help. What if the gospel's public? Paul one time went to it's the hardest word to say. I had to write the pronunciation in my hand, the Areopagus. Such a weird word. It's this sometimes referred to as Mars Hill. There's this moment in Paul's life, this New Testament missionary. He goes to Athens and he starts talking about the resurrection and the implications of the resurrection, that God has become king once again. And eventually they drag him to the Areopagus not because they're intrigued, but because they're threatened. Remember, Socrates, and everyone there would have known, Socrates was killed for two reasons. One, the corruption of the youth, and 2, the introduction of foreign gods. And so Paul is more or less put on trial in Acts 17. And listen, which says something, that there he is speaking to this place. And listen to what Paul says. It says, "Then Paul stood in front of the Areopagus and said, 'Athenians, I see how extremely religious you are in every way. For as I went through the city and looked carefully at the objects of your worship, I found among them an altar with the inscription, to an unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, he who is Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in shrines made by human hands.'" That is a massive public statement. What if the gospel is public and has public implications? It runs counter to our way of thinking and all of the nuances of our unique country. But here's what happened to me in all of this. I don't often lose sleep about what I'm going to say on a particular Sunday. But last Sunday afternoon, I think it was like one of those okay, this day's coming, this day's coming, this day's coming. After last Sunday's series was wrapped up, I suddenly was just hammered with this oh no, you know it's next weekend. And I spent a lot of time Sunday afternoon and Monday trying to practice some of my own centering prayer disciplines of letting go and not thinking about this because the trepidation hit me. But then Tuesday, when I go for my run Tuesday morning, I allow myself to start thinking about the weekend. And it's not that I haven't thought about it yet. It's that I've done all this research. I kind of got my system. I got it packaged. I got time blocked Tuesday through Friday, so just trust the system. But Tuesday on my run, I allow my mind just to go wherever it is. And I suddenly had this moment, and it was helpful to me of wait a minute. Houston, we've got a problem. And I think the problem looks something like this. On the one hand, the gospel is public, but there are all these mitigating, difficult, diversifying kind of things that come into play. There's tensions everywhere. It's not as simple as that. Because the gospel is public, that doesn't mean A or B. It just speaks to the tension. And there's 5 that I want to speak to. You could probably add 40 to these. First of all, diversity of people and culture and ideas is a value of Jesus. Just consider for a moment who Jesus' apostles were. In Luke 6, Jesus, after some time alone praying, finally names the 12. So I'll start at the beginning. Now, during those days, he went out to the mountain to pray, and he spent the night in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose 12 of them, whom he also named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James and John. Now, just to stop there, those 4 are fishermen, which means they probably don't own land. And by the nature of not owning land, that puts them at the very lowest, if not probably there's one rung below them, and that's orphaned children and single women. They're at the very bottom of the socioeconomic education scale. He calls 4 of them from this little tiny village to come be his disciples. And then we keep going. Then there's Philip, who I don't know anything about, and Bartholomew, and Matthew. He works for the IRS. In fact, I was doing some reading recently. Probably he worked for one of the Herod brothers, because we've talked before about there was these different sections of what we know as Israel that the Herod brothers were in charge of, and they hated each other because of this affair that happened. And so they both set up tax collectors at that border, because if you're going from one person's place to the other, they collected taxes as you were doing so. Tax collector who probably gives some of what he collects back to Herod, if not to Caesar. He's one of them. And then there's Thomas, and then there's James, son of Alphaeus, and then there's Simon, who's called the Zealot. You know what a zealot is? I mean, there's current parallels, but I don't even want to go there. Zealots were terrorists. They were extreme, dare I say, right-wing terrorists. Their conviction against Roman occupation was such that they were justified in almost any act of violence to get the Romans out of their country. One of their favorite things to do was to carry daggers on their person, and in a large crowd or at a big concert or the Super Bowl, what they would love to do is sidle up next to the dude, the Roman soldier, and while he was being bumped in from a million different directions, they had studied where the chinks in the soldier's armor was, and they would just slide a dagger into that spot and then slip away and wait for that guy to drop dead. So, I mean, again, I think it's important to stop and go, IRS, these hillbillies from the north who were fishermen, tax collector, And then you've got Simon the Zealot, and then you got Judas, son of James, and then Judas Iscariot. Now, Judas Iscariot is this weird word that scholars can't agree on what exactly it denotes, but it seems like the most likely thing is it's a geographical marker, and to the extent that it is, it speaks to a suburb of Jerusalem. So you've got hillbillies from the north who don't have an education, and then you've got this guy who went to Harvard. My point is simply this: there is a diversity of person and culture, and it doesn't stop there, because we often talk about apostles as men, but Luke seems to particularly be interested in reminding us that women were involved. In Luke 8, he jumps to this Mary. He's talking about all the people who were with Jesus. Mary Magdalene, called Magdalene, from whom 7 demons had gone out, so she was healthy. And Johanna, the wife of Herod's steward Huzzah. So among them is also a woman whose husband works for Herod. My point is simply this: it's not so simple as one homogeneous group of people. Was it accident? Well, we're told that Jesus prayed all night about who he would pick. What if the church has an opportunity to accomplish something that most of culture can't do, which is stand shoulder to shoulder with people whom they've had honest political dialogue but not agreement with? But Houston, we've got a problem. It doesn't stop there. Jesus also radically emphasized loving enemies and praying for those who persecute you. I think I'm going to explore this more in the series, but the leveraging of the term evil right now, it concerns me, because if it's permission to not pray for the person that we're labeling evil, and it's happening in both directions, then I think Jesus goes, hello. This was maybe his most radical idea, that you would proactively pray for the person who's looking for your demise, with whom you totally disagree. Jesus even says, if you love those who love you, whoop-de-doo. I always think of that Chris Farley, that scene, where he's like, well, Lottie freaking da. If you do that, in fact, this is such a serious time. Let's just watch that skit. We've got these mitigating complications, and one of them is Jesus calls us to love our enemy. But then there's more. Obviously, Jesus cares deeply and gives priority to those in need. One of the most helpful things that was said to me in this whole season of research was this, where someone said, Adam, I think what's important is that we agree that people need, that there's people who need things. It's important that we agree that people are the priority, and yet that we can respect that sometimes how we best go about that are different things. One of my favorite stories from Jesus is that time when some pretentious people are kind of chipping at him because he's hanging out with the wrong crowd, and he just kind of calls them on it, and he says, hey, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick. And then he makes this statement, and we did a whole series from this. Then he says, go and learn the meaning of this statement. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And in doing that, he's referencing the whole book of Hosea, which, as the Old Testament has, there's these different windows and different glimpses at the character of God, but Hosea's kind of culminating idea is this: you deserve justice, but I can't do it. I'm going to give you mercy instead. Clearly, Jesus' priority is mercy, but do you see how all of this creates a tension, a complication of how do we agree on all of this? Jesus gives priority to relationships. You don't need me telling you that. Hey, what matters? And Jesus picks a verse from Deuteronomy and one from Leviticus and goes, here's what matters. Love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then they're like, hey, so who's my neighbor? And Jesus uses a story to say, whatever you've defined as your adversary, the one who could ruin your life and your kids and your country, that's your neighbor. There's this huge priority on relationship. The one that messes with me the most is Jesus says, hey, you know how people are going to know who I am and what I'm like and that you're my followers? Because you'll have this really great beer festival. Because you'll have great music on Sundays. Because you'll meet in public space, and that's unintimidating. Because you'll split firewood for people. Because, no. I think this is the great challenge of this season. Jesus washes his disciples' feet, and then he looks at them and he says, okay, I got a new command. And they're like, come on, we've already got 1,023 of them in the New Testament. He says, here it is, love one another as As I've loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all people will know you're my followers if you love one another. What if the great opportunity and call of the church in this election season is to somehow model the value of the tension, that the truth is found in the tension? That generally speaking, and this is where I get frustrated. Like I think I'm more aligned now with the middle than I've ever been, because I just think sometimes we're offensive towards people. Like, name the issue. I'm not going to name any, but name the issue, the big ones. To say that the solution is simple, to me, it's taking a very low view of people. It's missing the fact that, name it, like the death penalty, abortion, just name it, the environment. To assume that it's just a really clear answer and nobody else is actually using their brain, to me, it misses the whole thing, that we've got, in some cases, hundreds of years of people thinking very deeply and honestly about issue, which doesn't mean that it's not okay to have your own personal conviction, but shouldn't we at least respect, it's not simple. It's complicated. And therefore, as a church, we have this opportunity to go I stand next to this person and worship God with this person who I disagree with on abortion, who I disagree with on just war theory, who I disagree with, name it, the environment, capital punishment. What if we have this chance to serve people in a unique way? I pulled up this week, in the midst of my self-loathing, I remembered I wrote this document this week. It was in 2007, my first semester of grad school. I wrote the paper, and it was actually the word that the paper had been written kind of became one of the manifestos, so to speak, of this church plan. It was Vern and those who were evaluating Teresa and I's fitness to plant a church. This became kind of inadvertently a major piece of the permission. But here's an excerpt from it. It's 10 a.m. on Sunday morning, and we just recently finished cleaning up a popular nightclub in town so that we could host our public gatherings. I always thought we'd meet in Miller's. The band is playing in the background, and as people pile through the doors to find a seat, soon the band will begin to lead us. I'm skipping ahead. The people piling in the doors come from all walks of life and from any number of backgrounds. Some are conservative Republicans, others are committed Democrats. Some were raised in the church, others hadn't stepped foot in one before they started hanging out with us. Some consider themselves disciples of Jesus, others are curious, and others used to be but are wondering. Many of them have had the political lines blurred for them since they started wrestling with us. The governor, a Democrat, is in the corner. Several Republican House members sit toward the middle of the room, and a bunch of students from Carroll are seated near the stage. By God's grace, Republicans and Democrats wrestle with God and his dreams together. In fact, more and more people don't use such terms to identify themselves as they're discovering that such labels are too simple and thus do not do justice to the complexity of their convictions and beliefs. What if there's need for an opportunity to be a different kind of faith community? Not one that asks you to leave your convictions at the door, but also asks you to not leave Jesus at the door as you have your convictions. The realization that I had on Monday, and I'm thankful for it, I was working on centering prayer, which is something I'm looking forward to talking about in January, and that'll be a rodeo. But the practice of centering prayer is just pick 20 minutes in your day where you surrender every thought that you have in order to try to maybe be able to reflex through the rest of the 23 hours and 40 minutes. And I came out of that time and I suddenly had this realization of I'm all kind of uptight about can we get to the other side of this election and still be this kind of community? And the realization is I don't control that. I have a responsibility, I have a role to play. I think I have a larger role probably than most, maybe even on the staff. Staff is of varying political convictions, but they don't speak to the extent that I do. So that's okay. And I think it's awesome that we're diverse as a staff. But here's what hit me. 2 questions, and I just leave them with you. To what extent, if any, do you value being a part of a community where it's safe for people from both sides of the aisle? And I think the second one is just as important. To the extent that you do, what's your responsibility to that vision and value? What role do we individually play? I would beg you to consider Facebook in that conversation. I honestly think that the healthiest thing any of us could do is not look at it again until early December. But that's just one, maybe I'm picking on you, example. What are the behaviors that would actually be becoming of a person who's trying to model a way of being community that says, hey, this is how people will know that we're for real. That we have genuine, positive relationship with people who will vote different than. I'd like to pray, God. Thanks, God, that it sure seems like you defy formula, that the vastness of who you are and the wisdom of who you are is too complicated to, it sure seems to be contained in law, but stories tends to get close. Thanks, Lord, for the story of your Son and the history behind it, of someone who expressed his power through service and self-giving love, who seems completely unoffendable, incredibly intelligent, and yet whose lasting mark was his willingness to serve first. Amen.
If you would like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us at narratechurch.org or look us up on Facebook and Instagram.